Thanks for joining today's ClearAdmit webinar. I am pleased to introduce you to Eric Johnson, who is the Executive Director of Graduate Career Services at the Kelley School of Business. He is an MBA career expert who will be sharing his expert advice on how to define your career path. After his presentation, he will be available to answer your questions, so be sure to enter your questions in the Q&A box. Now, I turn it over to Eric.
Great, thank you so much, Elliot, and for the whole team at ClearAdmit. One of the things that I've noticed as I work with a lot of MBA students is they're either running from their last job or they're running to their next job. And that's a very individual spectrum. Everybody comes to us at a very different place on that. And we talk about running from their current job. So if you're actually thinking about going to get an MBA, there's a reason why now is the time for you to go. Maybe you don't like your boss. Maybe you don't like the work that you're doing. Maybe you don't like the location that you're in. Maybe you don't like the compensation, the upwards potential. There's a lot of stuff going on that makes now the right time for you to consider leaving your particular job. And that's very normal. We also get some folks who show up who are running towards a new career. And to get some sense of where you're at on this spectrum, it's always good to answer some of these questions on here, right? What are some of the reasons you leave your job? Why aren't you considering a new role within your firm? Would you? What would that role need to look like? And as we're moving towards the other end of the spectrum about moving towards a new career, we want to help students come up with some clarity around what they want to do in 3 years, what they want to do in 5 years, what they might see themselves doing in 10 years. Get some clarity around the industry they want to be in or the company they want to work for. What's the division? What's the geography? What's the right kind of role? And I'm guessing if you're watching this right now, you probably know the answers to some of these questions, but I'm betting you don't know the answers to all of these questions. And that's really what we're trying to do today, is to try to get some sense of where are you at on this spectrum and where are you running. If I could get the PowerPoint to advance. And the nice thing about running is that it's actually very different for everybody. It's not a linear path. It's not fast. Every individual has a very different path from where they're at to where they want to go. And every individual has a different definition of success. So even when I get two students who show up who say, I really want to be in marketing, what marketing means to one is very different than what marketing means to another. And oftentimes when our students get to campus, they really don't know the difference between a product manager and a brand manager, or even a brand manager at a consumer goods company versus a brand manager at a sporting apparel company. So part of this running is all about exploring who you are today and who you want to be, and what are all the various roles that might fit you and which ones don't fit you, right? So as we think about what this process actually looks like, it begins with a really good foundation of self-discovery. And this is the work that you can begin doing today, and the bulk of where we're going to focus our time from this webinar. Things like, what are you interested in? What are you good at? What motivates you? And even within your current job, what are some of the things that you want to avoid in your next situation? And unfortunately, I'm going to give you a little hint. If you're trying to avoid your current boss, bad bosses exist everywhere. So what you're looking for is, what is it about the current context, the work that you do, the place that you do it at, the way it's incented? What is that you were looking to get away from? And what would great look like? What would a great context be? What would a great industry be? What would a great city be? What are the various rewards and recognitions that are important to you as you think about your post-MBA or post-master's career? Okay, and that's the self-discovery piece. Then, you know, from a process standpoint, you're going to conduct what's called a landscape assessment, where you'll have an opportunity to go out and study a variety of industries. You'll study a variety of companies. You'll have a chance to talk to alumni and talk to people who work at organizations you might be interested in. And all of this is to try to identify some similarities between these different environments and the things that you really want in your next environment. And once you really understand those two things, that's when you can actually begin the process of running towards a new career, okay? And you'll be able to tell your story. You'll be able to identify how you add value to a particular organization. You'll know who you need to talk to and who would be, you know, good at getting you the information that you need, and you'll know how to demonstrate your skills and passions in a way that's unique and relevant to you, okay? But it's really important as we get this process started, as you think about career discovery and career management pre-master's degree, let's really talk about what you need to learn about yourself, okay? And this is the process that we begin with every student who comes in the door at Kelley. We actually have a model we call DNIP, which stands for Discovery, Network, Interview, Perform. So when we do our coaching, and every student has a coach who works with them, we really begin with this process here of self-discovery. And the three big things that we look at with each student are their skills, their interests, and their values, okay? And as we go through it, the one thing that we always ask is that you be honest with yourself. In fact, there's a quote that I really like. This is the most important gift that we can give someone is the ability to be honest with themselves, okay? Now, what does that mean and why is that important? As you're going through the process of self-discovery, it's important that you're really being honest with what you have and what you possess today, and that you're taking some time to get some external feedback to validate those things. So for instance, it's not unusual for a company in the future that you might have talked to say that they're really interested in someone who's got strong analytical ability. But if you're not strong analytically today, just be honest with yourself. That's a gap you may have to close, and that might be a reason why you choose one program over another, because that's an area you need to improve. Same thing with interests. We get a lot of people who come here who say they're very interested in getting into consulting, but what they think that consulting is, which is providing organizations with big picture strategy that helps them make landscape changes for the future, and what consulting actually is, which is a lot of PowerPoint and Excel between the hours of 8 p.m. and midnight, those aren't the same thing. So what you really want to try to get is as specific as possible. What are the things you're good at? What are the things you're interested in? And what are your core values? And how do all these things work together to make you, you, okay? So let's talk just a little bit about skills. When I say skills, what we're really looking at here are for you to begin to self-identify today. What are your top 3 to 5 strengths? Again, trying to be as specific as possible. So if you think you've got strong interpersonal skills, try to think of an example where you demonstrate strong interpersonal skills. Because some people are really strong meeting with others one-on-one. Some people are really strong giving presentations to large groups. Some are strong orally. Some are strong more with written communication. So as you think about your strengths, what are 3 to 5 that really stand out about you? And what are examples of how you've demonstrated these strengths, okay? Second, you really want to start thinking about how these things actually set you apart from your peers, right? What makes you different from others? And that might be a very specific skill, or it might be the sum of all of the skills that you have together. So let's think of a couple of examples, okay? We've got a lot of folks who come to us with a music performance background, right? Somebody who has performed as a cellist in front of a large symphony orchestra has shown an ability to perform under pressure in front of large environments when, you know, the risk for failure is pretty high. That's actually a really unique skill that that person can bring to an MBA program. Someone who's had an opportunity to implement multiple projects successfully in multiple different countries probably has a unique skill set. If you happen to be one of those people who currently works in a heavily regulated environment, like the pharmaceutical industry or the medical device industry, transportation, government, the ability to deal with regulation successfully is in and of itself a really interesting skill. But what's also cool about that is there are some transferable characteristics underneath that, which are also really important and valuable. So if you work in a heavily regulated environment, you probably don't realize that you're very good at adapting to change, because regulations, policies, those things change all the time. And when they change, there's often fairly significant impact of the change. And so the ability to adapt quickly to a change in circumstances is a really important differentiating skill. The other thing about working in a heavily regulated environment is it probably means you've got a lot of skills at influencing people over whom you don't have a lot of authority. So before I actually came to the Kelley School of Business, I worked for Eli Lilly and Company for 10 years, primarily in marketing roles. And my last position, I was the chief marketing officer in the United Kingdom. And what was interesting about that is I was constantly working with the head of medical and the head of legal and the head of quality and the head of sales and the head of regulatory in order to make decisions that affected our organization and ultimately led to value for their customers. So if you've been in similar situations where you've worked across different functions, especially when incentives are actually built to work against you, right? So as a marketer, my job was to drive sales. The regulatory incentive was actually to avoid that the companies say anything off-label or illegal. So they would have an incentive for me to not say anything. I have an incentive to say whatever I need to. Our ability to work together successfully shows a pretty high level of transferable skills when it comes to influencing people over whom you don't have authority. So what are some of those situations that you find yourself in today, and how do they set you apart? And going back to our earlier commentary, what's interesting about those skills is they are valued in different ways by different companies. Some companies operate in heavily regulated environments in the future. Some companies are very team driven, whereas other cultures are very individual driven. And so knowing not only where are you good, but what you like about all those different situations can begin to inform some decisions you might want to make about the type of organizations you want to work for in the future. Again, you don't have to know what kind of company you want to work for in the future. You just have to know what works for you today and what makes you different, okay? Interests are critically important as you think about managing your career, especially prior to going back and getting a degree. So some things you might want to be thinking about today are, what are your top 3 to 5 interests? And I'm talking about when you think about the moments you have over the course of a day, over the course of a week, when time simply disappears, what are you doing? Or put another way, if you could do anything and money were no object, what would you choose to do and why? And some of you might be in roles today where you say, hey, coming off my undergraduate degree, I went out and I did exactly what I thought my purpose was, and I'm not making enough money doing it. Okay, that's okay. Let's not lose sight of what it was that drew you into that job that you still find interesting and motivating today. And what we can look for in the future as you work with a career coach is, what are circumstances and situations at which you can make more money than you're making today, or where the things that you really like and you find interesting are actually valued in a new context that pays a lot more money. And I'm going to give you a couple of examples of those here in a few minutes. So what are some things that you enjoy doing in your free time? Here's an interesting thing you can do, especially with the holidays coming up. Have you ever bothered to ask people what they find interesting about you? Right? And I didn't mention this on the previous slide, but in the same breath, you can also ask them, hey, what are some of the things that you would come to me to help you with? And that gets at some of the strengths and skills that other people might see in you, right? So what is it that people think you're good at? And then what do people find interesting about you? And then when your work has aligned with your interests, how has that gone? Okay. The reason these things are important is for a few reasons. One, I don't view our job here at the Kelley School of Business and our Career Center as simply getting you a job, but rather to get you a job that you actually enjoy, but also one that you're able to perform at and do particularly well, okay? And that actually performance is what leads to promotions and bonuses and career enhancement in the future, okay? And if you go into a career that you're not interested in, you're not gonna be motivated, you're not gonna perform, and it's not gonna work well for you. Similarly, what we've noticed over the last few years is a significant increase in the numbers and types of companies who value the MBA as they hire people to come on board. And so whereas 15, 20 years ago when I was getting my MBA, I was largely restricted to Fortune 500 companies and a lot of consulting firms who worked for them. These days, there are literally thousands of companies that value the MBA, and industries like sports and entertainment, government, social impact, global reaching roles from an entry level perspective. Like those things are now more attainable for MBAs, but in order to be hired into those, you've got to work with coaches to understand how your interests align with these opportunities. And then you've got to figure out, how do I translate that opportunity in a way where a company I'm interested in would see me as a good fit for their organization, okay? So those interests can help your coaches greatly figure out how to channel you into the right times, the companies, industries, et cetera, that you might be a good fit with, okay? And I'm going to pause here because it looks like there's a question. Do you find that people are or are not self-aware of their own strengths, and that employers or managers view people's strengths different than the individual views himself? Yes. Yes to both questions. What's interesting about us as individuals is we all have an identity, which is how we see ourselves, and we all have a reputation, which is how other people see us. And what's really important for you right now, for everybody, for me, for the folks who are with us here on the webinar, the team at Clear Admit, what's really important is that you have some clarity around both of those things. So a lot of what we're talking about today is about you really understanding your identity, how you view yourself. What are the things you think you're good at? What are you interested in? And what are your values, which we're going to talk about here in just a minute. However, I also think it's good if you have the time and the ability to go ahead and get some information about your reputation. How do other people see you? If you think you're good at working through conflict, do the other teammates, your managers, your supervisors, do they think that you're good at working through conflict too? Why or why not? And what's interesting about those situations is that you may actually find something you think you're particularly good at. Somebody else might say, well, yeah, you're good at that, but it doesn't really set you apart because everybody here is sort of expected to be good at that too. And that's a really interesting insight for us as individuals. And I'll give you a really good example. So when I was in marketing, I thought I was really good at creating motivational presentations, that when I got in front of a sales force, I really knew what to say to motivate people to action. And what I learned quickly is that was a skill that was really a point of parity for me with regards to my counterparts at Eli Lilly and Company, because anybody who got in front of the sales force, generally speaking, was chosen by their team because they had the ability to move and motivate others. So whereas I thought that was something that might set me up really strongly for a leadership position in the future, I found that would be nice, but that wasn't going to be enough. What really stood out for me was actually the ability to help people understand how to relate to different types of personalities, so be flexible in their own style. That was something I understood in a way that was different than what other people were able to do. And that wasn't something I appreciated about myself until I got that feedback from a manager who happened to be out in the sales force. He said, hey, you know what really sets you apart? You treat each individual salesperson as a unique skill set. And the way that you coach and motivate each of them is different, which actually maximizes their potential. And my response was, well, doesn't everybody do that? And he said, actually, no. Most people have one style of leadership and they try to get everybody to follow it the same way. So I didn't even realize that was something that set me apart until I got the feedback that, in fact, it was. And so I think that it's important that you understand your identity. It's important you get some feedback on your reputation. And I think it could go both ways, where what you think you're good at, you're not, what you think you're good at, you are, and what other people think you're good at might surprise you. You might not even realize the value that you're adding to the organization. So I think it's always good to get some of that feedback and to try to accept it first before making a decision about whether to apply it or not. So I hope that answered the question. How can one explain and connect the motivation to go into consulting as a short-term goal and then start a social enterprise venture as a longer-term goal? How will a career in consulting help with this longer-term goal? How bad is it if one does not know what sector one wants to have as a longer-term social enterprise? Okay, so there are a lot of questions in there. So I'm gonna tie those back to interests. What I would argue is that the question here is from someone who's probably still running from a job that they're in, okay? Because what's interesting about consulting is a huge term. There's external consulting and there's internal consulting. With external consulting, you can do consulting in supply chain, you can do consulting in marketing, you can do consulting in strategy and operations. And even within supply chain, you can consult on procurement, process improvement, Six Sigma, acquisition, logistics, manufacturing. And then below that, there's still the types of decisions that you're trying to drive within a particular organization. And all of that is married with what would make you a good fit for that particular role. So when I think about how does someone explain that they want to get into consulting, and then we'll get through the rest of this, how to get into consulting, great clarity comes from all the things that we're talking about here, and then being able to match that up with the part of the organization that values it. So if you're able to say, you know, I have a background in engineering, particularly mechanical engineering, and I appreciate the value of detail, of analytics, of process improvement, of optimizing performance, and the way that different parts can work together to create something that's greater than the sum of the whole. And then I think that makes me a great fit for EY supply chain consulting, because a lot of your clients are looking to take advantage of these skills to create greater impact through expense reduction and ultimately improved efficiency over time. Wow, you just tied your interests and your skills to a very specific type of consulting, and that's how you match these two things up to get into that. Now, what I would suggest to you is if you have a longer term goal around social impact, what you might want to think about is answering the question, why does that have to be a longer term goal? Is there, or are there a series of organizations today who actually are very good at doing social impact consulting? And the answer actually is yes, there are. They are actually places like EY and Deloitte, McKinsey and Bain and Boston. They all have clients who are looking to improve their social impact or their carbon footprint. In many cases, because of government regulations like reducing fuel burn off, decreasing carbon footprint for the purposes of taking advantage of carbon tax credits. I mean, there's a lot of different social impact-based consulting gigs that exist today. So my question would be, can you get enough clarity about the organizations that are out there who value that skill set and actually bring that interest and, I would argue, that value to the table to begin to demonstrate why you're a great fit for that role? And I think what even makes you more powerful with that is if there are things that you're doing today that are actually related to social impact, particularly professionally. So it's a value a lot of people have. A lot of people say, what I really want to do is help the world be more social responsible. I care a lot about that today. But there are actually a very small number of people who are doing that beyond using reusable water bottles and maximizing their recycling. So to what degree are you working within your current community to help your community reduce its energy utilization? Are there organizations within your community who are looking for greater organizational responsibility as it comes to dealing with the homeless population? So what is the social issue that you have a lot of passion about? And what are some of the things that you're doing today to make that issue something that is starting to be resolved? Those are skills and those are interests. And if you get to an MBA program and you find an organization that cares about social impact consulting, and you've actually begun to do some work, even on a volunteer basis, you've now demonstrated that you've got relevant skills, you're now more interesting to talk to, and you're more of a unique candidate. And relevance, interesting, and unique are the three things you have to show in a job interview to get the offer. And so the more you can understand that social impact thing today and how that fits with your skill set and your experiences, the easier it is to tell the story to the right consulting firm to land the job. And then my advice would always be, never tell an organization you're trying to get some experience with them so you can do something else later. Because if I think I'm going to lose you, especially in a 3 to 5 year time horizon, I'm not going to hire you in the first place. So you're never going to communicate that you want to leave an organization while you're in the process of interviewing for that organization. All right. How can I find my strengths if I have a generalist profile where I have been working across different companies in totally different domains? Okay. I'm going to come back here to the skills one. So a lot of that really depends on what your definition of generalist is, and working across different companies in totally different domains. Here's the thing. You probably don't realize that some of the work that you're doing today actually is setting you up with a skill set that's pretty valuable and different when you get your MBA. So let me give you a good example. We have a lot of veterans who come to us who've been on international deployments. And when they arrive, this is one of the big things that they say. They say, hey, listen, my job was procurement. I was the guy who knew how to obtain all of the resources, the people, the equipment that we needed in order to do our job on XYZ deployment. But there was somebody like me operating within every unit, in every country, all around the world, all at one time. How does that actually make me unique and different? Well, in an MBA population of 200 to 500, where a lot of people are coming with backgrounds in engineering, they're coming where they work for advertising agencies. They used to be English teachers working in foreign countries. They used to be working for the Peace Corps in poor parts of the world. They used to be sales representatives. Those are very popular roles to have before people come to school. None of those actually involve the acquisition of people, talent, equipment, resources in international locations for the purposes of achieving an agenda or obtaining an objective. So what you do today, even if you don't think it makes you that different, if these are things that you find you are particularly good at, collectively, relative to an average MBA population, there are things about you that are going to stand out. So don't worry too much about identifying the things that make you different from the world that you know today. Think about the things that you are particularly good at and some examples that back those up. So focus on these top two bullets. And then when you get to your school and you work with a career coach, you can begin to build the story about how those set you apart from the rest of your peers. But trust me, there's a lot of diversity in backgrounds in various MBA and master's programs. And what you think is generalist today will make you a specialist in the future. Right? We see a lot of that with analytics too. A lot of folks say, well, I do analytics, but doesn't everybody do analytics? Not necessarily. You know, if you work in Jump or you work in SPSS, you work in Excel, or you work with, SAS, like you might be taking for granted because everybody you work with is SAS certified and everybody uses it. But the number of MBA students who are competent in SAS is extraordinarily small. The number who can code is extraordinarily small. The number who are Six Sigma Green Belt certified, extraordinarily small. In your world, you might work with people who have all those things, but in your next world, you won't. So what makes you really good today? When you're brought on a job or when you switch companies, what were you hired for? Why did they choose you over other candidates? If you've switched companies, or if you work for a company that does a lot of support work like consulting and you've had multiple clients, there's still a reason why you were picked off the bench and assigned to a particular project. So if you don't know what it was, ask the partner, ask the manager, ask the hiring manager. Hey, I love being here. I really felt like I was the strongest candidate. But in your own words, what were the two reasons why you picked me over everybody else that you could have chosen? Because those are the things that set you apart, and you might not even realize how valuable those things are. So definitely go get some of the feedback, but also notice what you're good at and begin building the story around that today. And then we'll solve for the differentiation piece when you get to campus, okay? Same thing with values, and values kind of builds off that question. One of the big things that I've learned is that not many of our students arrive on campus having really thought about what their values are and why their values are important. And if you'd like to better understand some of yours, there are two resources that I highly recommend you check out. One of them is called the VIA Character Institute. So it's VIA character.org, and they have a free values assessment, and you'll go through and you'll answer a battery of 50 or 60 questions, and then based on that they sort of rank values from 1 to 24 in terms of how they show up in the decisions that you make. Now listen, the purpose of the report is not for you to notice your bottom 3 to 4 values and figure out how to make them stronger. The purpose of the report is to notice what are the top 5 or 6 values that show up for you, and to begin to think about why those things make you you, and which values are extremely important to you professionally, and which values are extremely important to you personally, and what's the life you want to have that actually allows you to honor those values, okay? There's also a company out there called the Good Works Project, and if you just do an internet search on Good Works Value Sorter, and you'll get taken to a website, and they've got a list of like 25 values, and instead of taking a survey on them, you drag them into buckets of most important, kind of important, sort of, you know, average, not that important, definitely not important. But you've got caps. You can only put 4 in the most important bucket. And so you can't have every value being equal to you. But these are really good ways for you to begin to understand your values. And then you can think about when has your values aligned with the work that you've done, and how did that feel? All right, and in the job you're in today, so again, part of why we're doing this is to understand, why are you leaving the job that you're in? There might be a values violation that's going on for you right now that you couldn't really put the words on it, and it's that value that you want to make sure it doesn't get compromised in the future. So we'll go back to that social impact one, right? So I loved my time at Eli Lilly. I have nothing but great things to say about Eli Lilly and Company. But I did work with a colleague who had a huge value around sustainability, and particularly with regards to energy and with regards to like natural resources. Lilly, phenomenal pharmaceutical firm, you know, and everybody's got their different opinions on the healthcare system. But I always felt like the people I worked with were highly ethical, were very good at their jobs, and the medicines that were made were important, right? I had a value around human care, and that was honored by the work that I did at Lilly. But as an organization, we really didn't pay a whole lot of attention to inputs when it came to manufacturing. I mean, obviously you have to be the right ingredients, but we didn't have a strong sustainability program. The organization barely had a recycling program when I left. And certainly the employees weren't very good at using it. And so I had a colleague who was constantly feeling tense and stressed out every time someone would throw a plastic bottle in a trash can, much less they had a much more difficult time even seeing that value of social impact and sustainability as they defined it exist within the fabric of the strategy of the organization. And it just wasn't making him happy. And ultimately he ended up deciding that he needed to go to a different place. And that's totally cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But know what some of your values are and how they align with the work you do or the work you want to do, and where there maybe has been a disconnect. So I'll share a few of mine. I've got a big value around adventure. And if you've ever taken personality types, I'm an ESFP, which kind of means if there isn't a crisis going on, I'll create one just so I have something to do, right? That's not a value everybody holds. But my value of adventure means I really like getting into situations where I don't know what the outcome is. I'm not risk averse in the least bit. In fact, I like to seek out risk. I like jobs that are constantly dealing with change. I like jobs that are constantly dealing with ambiguity. And the role that I'm in right now, that's what we do here. The higher education master's degree landscape is going through all kinds of changes with regards to specialized master's degrees, with regards to online education. We've got companies who are actually starting to create their own master's degrees. And all of that presents a really unique opportunity for us to continue to think about how are we reinventing ourselves to stay ahead of the curve when it comes to education, but also career coaching and professional development. I love that. But somebody who's got a value around dependability, reliability, the status quo, history as an important precursor for the future, like this is not a job they would find themselves highly satisfied in, because those values are constantly being interrupted by the work that we do, okay? I also love getting outdoors, right? I like going on epic hikes and taking big vacations. So a job that actually allows me enough time off, enough compensation, in order to do those things actually allows me to lead a life that's meaningful too, right? I also have a big value around continuous improvement. So I like being in a role where the organization I work for continues to invest in the growth and development of its individuals. So I get that at the university, and it's something I get to do for other people. And that value of continuous improvement is my work, and it's also my workplace. And so I find my satisfaction is very high because my values are showing up in the workplace, right? So know what your values are and then know what they mean to you. So we have a lot of students who come to us and say, I have a value around family. So for me, work-life balance is important. Well, okay, great. Some jobs are jobs you get to work at 8, you get to go home at 6, you don't have to really do a whole lot of email in the evenings, and when you get to work the next day, you're good. If you've got a doctor's appointment, you can go anytime you need to go. If your kid is sick, you can work from home. Like, that's a very flexible work environment. For some people who have a value around family, that work environment honors that value, okay? I also know a lot of investment bankers who work 90 to 100 hours a week who have a value around family. For them, the way they define it is that they get well paid in their jobs. They get to bring home compensation that is well beyond what they otherwise could have made in their roles. And that allows them to provide for their family in ways that they never were provided for when they were kids. And that's not just how they live, but also the choices they get to make around vacations, vehicles that they get to own, higher end sports that maybe their kids want to be involved in that, you know, require a lot of resource outlay. And they would say, I honor my value of family based on the level of compensation that I make. And that's important to me because opportunity is something I didn't have. Neither one is right or wrong. They're both right by their own definition. So, and they're both honoring the value of family. So for you, think about not just what are the terms, what are those values, but what do they really mean? And which ones are you unwilling to compromise? Because that clarity allows you to really align yourself well with the different organizations that you might want to go to work for. So Amazon is kind of a classic example, right? There's been a lot written about Amazon being a fairly difficult place to work. I disagree. I'll agree it's not for everybody. I don't think there's any organization that's for anybody. The interesting thing about Amazon is that they're very transparent about their goals. They're very transparent about what it takes to achieve those goals. They're very good at reward and recognition when you hit your goals. They're very good at feedback and development, but they're not the kind of place that's gonna, you know, hug everybody and say it's okay if you don't meet your goals because clearly it wasn't your fault. So if you're one of those people that really likes operating in teams because individual accountability is kind of scary, if you're one of those people that really values real-time feedback, if you're one of those people that's really motivated by a transparent goal, if you're one of those people that has a value around accountability, Amazon is a great place to be. If you're one of those people that really values a heavily collaborative environment, one that's constantly celebrating everybody's birthdays, one that allows for a lot of flexibility around goals, or even has soft targets, or even doesn't have goals at all, which some organizations have, believe it or not, that's not the place for you. And it all comes down to what your personal values are and how they align with the organization that you're thinking about going to work for, okay? So what's another way to think about this? Because all of these things are very internally focused, right? What are my skills? What are my values? What are my interests? Well, if you think about this from a world of work standpoint, you take a look at this graph. This is not my graph, and I've seen this created by so many people, I'm not sure who to attribute it to. But these bubbles, skills, interests, values, also show up in here with regards to market forces like supply and demand, okay? So you've got these circles. What are the things that you're good at? Skills. What are the things you love? Interests. What are the things you can be paid for? Demand. What are the things the world needs? Demand and values, right? Kind of lines up in there. And what's important for you from a career management standpoint is to answer the question, how do these circles line up for you? Where do you want to work, and what kind of jobs do you want to have that allow you a life where these circles all tend to line up, okay? I happen to be one of those lucky people where I'm that star there in the middle, right? I love to coach. I love to develop young leaders, right? I'm sure if you're thinking about going to a master's degree program, particularly an MBA, you kind of want to make sure that there's career support available to you from competent individuals who work with organizations you're interested in being at, right? So that's something you need. Obviously, it's my job. It's something I can be paid for. So if I love it, I'm good at it, you need it, there's an income, then my circles align. But Doesn't have to work that way for everybody. And I'm going to go back to one of our students who came here as a musician. Her name was Julia. She'd given me permission to talk about her experience here. She was a concert pianist before she came to Kelley. And she had performed in front of big audiences. She had performed on her own. She'd performed with teams. She'd performed for fairly important people. She'd also run her own business, giving music lessons. And when she came to us, she kind of had discovered that the music as a job wasn't necessarily what she wanted to do anymore. There wasn't an opportunity for significant income growth over time. And she, didn't feel like working as many nights and weekends as she had previously been working, because that's when people demand music, right? When they're not at work. What was interesting about that, though, as she went through it, is she began to identify, as I mentioned earlier, the ability to perform under pressure, a heavy attention to detail, a commitment to deliberate practice, a strong initiative, the ability to work in teams, the ability to adapt quickly to changes, which if you've ever watched an orchestra play, there's a lot of that going on at any one time. And what I didn't appreciate until I really met her is that music theory is all about pattern recognition, and pattern recognition is the heart of data analytics. And so she was immediately able to pick up a lot of the theories behind data analytics and economics because of what she brought to the table from a pattern recognition standpoint. So ultimately, she was able to get into a job working in a strategic business development role for a major Fortune 100 organization that valued all of those skills: change, adaptability, initiative, coachability, attention to detail, the ability to work well with others of different backgrounds, of different types. Like, they took advantage of those skills. For her, that became a profession. She was paid for it, and she was good at it, and she loved it. In her after hours, she became the lead singer of a garage band, right? And they perform a couple of times a month out in public in the city that she now lives in. So she loves music. She's good at it. For her, that's become a passion instead of a profession, because if you've ever been in a garage band, you don't make any money on it. You spend more than you make to be involved in it. And so she's got these circles, but they don't all overlap in the same place. But she would tell you she leads a happy and balanced life because she knows her skills, her interests, her values, and how they fit in the world of work so that she can make a life that works well for her, okay? The other thing that I want to point out as a result of doing all of this is, if you really understand yourself, you're already set up for networking and for interviewing, because networking is all about who you want to talk to and what conversation you want to have. And so if you know your skills, interests, and values, it should help you identify who you want to talk to. And then the questions that you're going to ask are, how do these values show up in the workplace? What are the leadership values that you see? How does your organization feel about social impact, right? How does your organization view teamwork, right? When people leave the organization, what are the number one reasons why they leave, right? Those are great networking conversations. They're so much better than what's your culture and what's an average day like. Like, you are set up to have more personalized, more valuable, and more interesting networking conversations because you know yourself and you know what you're looking for, so you know what to ask. You're also really set up to be a strong interviewer, because the most common interview questions that you're going to get are, tell me about yourself. What are your greatest strengths? What are your greatest weaknesses? How do you work well on a team? How do you influence people without authority? How do your previous coworkers describe you? Where do you see yourself in a few years? Right? And all of that is the heart of self-discovery. What you won't need to work on the content of your answers. You're just going to need to work on being able to say them in an interesting and persuasive way in 2 minutes or less. So if you really get this stuff done well, you're going to enter an MBA program or any master's program with an enormous amount of clarity relative to other people as it comes to the job search. So with that, I'll take any questions that haven't already been asked. I know there are questions about, will the webinar be made available? It sounds like it will. What are some other questions that you might have that I haven't had a chance to answer? I know one that tends to come up a lot is how do I best figure out how to turn some of my interests, especially if they're a little unique, into jobs, and will I have a difficult time the more unique my interest is finding a job on a classic MBA timeline? And the answer is it depends, okay? So I've got a couple students right now, for instance, who are really interested in the gaming industry. And what we've learned together through the gaming career search is that is an industry that tends to operate on more of a just-in-time hiring process. So internships and full-time jobs tend to be issued in the March, April timeframe. Folks who are really interested in entrepreneurship and working for startups, especially tech-based startups, might find that they're looking at a little bit later career search than an average MBA student. But here's the thing, even though it starts a little bit later, the success ratios are actually better. And the reason that they're better is because the student's ability to communicate what they're interested in and why they would be a good fit and what makes them different they're just better. They are better when you're pursuing your passions, okay? The world of sports is another one that comes up a lot when people are talking about turning their interests into jobs. And if you take a broad definition of sports, there are jobs that are available from the classic MBA timeline all the way through the summer. Somebody who wants to work for a franchise is probably looking at a just-in-time job for not much money, to be honest. Someone who's interested in working for a place like Under Armour, that obviously makes sports apparel, well, there are classic MBA jobs that are available there. There are also organizations like AT&T, which do an enormous amount of sports sponsorship. And so they're involved in a lot of different sports from the business side of things. And of course, AT&T hires on a fairly traditional timeline too. And so, you know, franchise, an apparel company, and a big Fortune 500 firm are all examples of where the interest of sports can be valued. And all of them are also looking for, you know, different skills from each other. So which one you'd be a good fit for will depend on what you bring to the table. And of course, they have different timelines. So depending on your individual risk profile, which goes back to your values, will help us better understand where to help steer your career search. So those are some examples of how these things work together on some of the more specific interests. All right, how quickly do I need to decide what industry function I want to move into? Honestly, not that early. I think what I tend to encourage is that we get a really good idea of what's the work that you want to do on a regular basis. And that's not even exactly function. That's more about, do you want to be somebody who is tending to do a lot of implementation, or do you want to be somebody who tends to do a little bit more of the strategic work? Do you want to be someone who's dealing with a lot of creativity and ambiguity, or are you somebody who prefers to be working with details and analytics? Like, if we can get a sense of the work that is meaningful to you, then we can actually back that up into, well, how does data analytics show up in finance? And how does data analytics show up in marketing? And how does data analytics show up in supply chain? And then based on that, we can then back ourselves up into a particular industry. And it's not unusual for students to come all the time and say, I really want to work for the transportation industry. And we'll get into, well, why? And a lot of it is a value around travel and an interest in customer service. Well, there are a lot of industries where you have an opportunity to travel that are focused on optimizing an end user experience. And so, you know, we can actually identify maybe organizations or industries somebody had never thought of before that they begin to consider as a result of that. So my advice would be, in the fall of your first year, if you can get some clarity around the work you want to do, then as you move into the spring, you know, the function and the industry will either align quickly, or we'll be able to pull them together quickly so that you can begin to figure out which companies are the right ones to interview with. Am I available to meet with students to walk through this coaching process? Well, if you come to Kelley, I am. Of course, this is what my team does. Everybody here is a certified coach. I'm a certified coach. If you happen to be a webinar attendee, there's going to be some information here in a little bit about how you can get a hold of Kelley. We have historically offered some free coaching appointments in the spring for folks who've applied to the school. I imagine that'd be something we would consider again this year. And if we do, and you've applied to us, then somebody from my office, it could be me, would be happy to meet with you. If it's not me, my team does exactly what I do, and so that opportunity would exist. But nothing that we're offering through any other channels. Hopefully I answered that. What's the importance of personal brand and how does it impact your career success? Well, here's what I like to say. Your parents probably told you at some point in time, it doesn't really matter what other people think of you. It matters what you think of you. That's actually kind of crap. I mean, what you think of yourself matters. But as it comes to the world of work, what other people think about you it's actually really important, because if they don't think you're any good at the job they're hiring for, or they don't want to be stuck in an airport with you for 5 hours, you're not going to get hired. Personal brand is critically important. I think personal brand and reputation are very synonymous. And I think you play a very active role in how you manage those things. And so your personal brand really is the sum of your skills, interests, and values, and then how you choose to activate that through your marketing channels like resume, LinkedIn profile, informational interviewing, any networking activity you get into, your elevator pitch. I have many MBA students who have blog sites that they start in order to begin to write on a particular type of work or on a particular industry in order to help them stand out and begin to get the word out about things that they're interested in and good at. Your personal brand is critical. You'll ultimately be hired based on the strength of your personal brand. Let's see. How do I best figure out whether an MBA or specialized master's is better for me? Okay, that's a great conversation to have with any school that you're thinking about applying for. Here's what I'm going to tell you. An MBA is a phenomenal degree for someone who's looking to make a pretty significant career transition. Okay, so if you're a sales rep and you want to be a financial analyst, an MBA is critically important to you. What I'll also say is a lot of jobs that candidates think of as being very specialized are actually often more general management jobs. So here's a good example. A lot of people say brand manager job at Procter & Gamble is a marketing job. It's not. I mean, you work in the marketing department, but the brand manager has P&L responsibility. So it's a marketing job, it's a finance job, it's a supply chain job. You deal with pricing, you deal with forecasting, so you have research, you have analytics. It's a general management job. And so an MBA is a general management degree. Even if you major in something, you learn about all the different disciplines, because if you get into product management or brand management, or if you're a financial analyst at an organization where you're working with folks in the other disciplines, if you get into supply chain management, particularly the more you work in operations and procurement and process improvement, all of those are general management jobs. So you have to understand the needs of the end user. You have to understand the steps to deliver value to the end user, and you have to understand the impact of the expenses to the organization in order to be able to do that as profitably as possible. So if you're targeting a general management job, you need an MBA. If you're also switching from one function to another, you need an MBA. A specialized master's degree, honestly, is a fairly rare thing from a market value standpoint, and it tends to be really good for someone who has experience in a field, is looking to stay in that field, look long-term, short-term and long-term, and is looking to do some career enhancement. So a great example of that is I'm currently working with someone who's an advertising executive at a pretty big advertising firm based out of Chicago, who does have an interest in becoming a marketing specialist at a consumer goods company in the Chicago area. So an MS in marketing is beautiful for that person because they're bringing some skills to the table. They want to stay in marketing. What they really need to do is better understand the analytics side of things and better understand the various channels to disseminate a message. And they desire to really be a technical marketer in the next role that they go into. That's what I think an MS can do for you. A specialized master's really helps you accelerate within a given field. A specialized master's is also good for someone who within their firm is seen as someone who has high potential, but who needs to learn how to see the company from other lenses. And so if you want to stay with your organization and build out some competencies, one way to do that is to work rotations around your company. The other is to pick up a specialized master's degree that might allow you to better understand the way things work. And my advice would be, if you are looking to stay at your company over time and you're thinking about a specialized master's degree, focus on the one that your company is centered around. So for instance, if you're in finance at Procter & Gamble, you might want to think about getting a specialized master's degree in marketing, because P&G at the end of the day, like they're centered, the marketing department, so to speak, is the driver of the organization, right? At FedEx, the supply chain, right? It's the logistics group is the one. So you might think about getting a master's in supply chain management if you've been in a marketing or customer service role at FedEx and you want to stay with the organization. So that's how I look at the specialized masters and how I differentiate it. But if you ever have questions about that, you can talk to any admissions counselor at any of the schools. All right, for career shifters, when applying, is it necessary to connect your future goals to your most recent jobs? Not necessarily. I think it's necessary for you to connect your future goals with some aspects of your current job, but also the things that you're interested in some of your values. Back to what we talked about today. And when you think about your most recent job, don't think about the job title and the day-to-day roles and responsibilities, but think about the work that you might be doing today that would help you in your future job. So the transferable skills that we've talked about today, influencing people without authority, analytics, decision-making under pressure, dealing with change management. There's a lot of stuff that happens in the context of a job that might matter to your future job, even if your technical responsibilities don't exactly match that future one. So if you can identify a couple of those softer, more transferable skills with an interest that you can back up with, like, this is a real interest because here's the stuff I've done in my life that has allowed me to live this interest, and my values because I've taken these assessments and here's how they've shown up and here's how I know that value plays. If you can write an essay that ties those three things together to a role, I mean, you're going to crush your essays, and I read them. So trust me, I know. Let's see, would I recommend for a financial analyst interested in sales? I think it would depend on what kind of sales you want to do. If you're interested in going into more of a business development role, so a good example of that is Microsoft. They have a strategic business development role that's externally facing. You're going to want an MBA for that because that's really what they hire people into. If you're interested in B2B sales, so if you're thinking about going to work for a company like Ecolab or GE or Boeing or places like that, where the products that you make go into products that end up being used by an end user, you're going to want an MBA for that too, because that really is a general management type role. If you're a financial analyst and you're interested in sales that would be considered a lateral move, probably where you're at. So places like pharmaceutical companies, places like, well, you know, some of the mutual funds, for instance, and client acquisition side of things. So Merrill Lynch, for instance, would be a good example. What I recommend is actually probably to start applying for jobs, because believe it or not, if you've got an undergraduate degree and some work experience where you've been able to demonstrate an impact, you're probably already qualified for a lot of sales roles today. So I would say the more strategic and more important the sales, the more that salesperson has empowerment over a variety of things like pricing and customization, the more an MBA is going to be pretty important. If you do happen to be one of those ones where your financial analysis role has been largely based in a cube, doing a lot of work in Excel, and you haven't had a lot of end user contact or really even contact with the marketing department, there are a few specialized master's degrees in sales capabilities and sales management, and I would recommend going ahead and getting one of those. The other thing you can consider is if your organization has a sales training department, you can also ask if you can sit through the sales training component and possibly even do a relief sales role with your company, say if somebody goes out for medical leave or FMLA or something like that. So those would be some things I'd think about. Side projects we should get involved in that help excel career. Anything that helps do one of two things. One, that helps your interest to become something more than what you say, or something that builds a skill set that you don't have that you're going to need. So for instance, if you have a value or an interest in social impact, but all you're really doing today is making sure everybody in your household recycles everything. I would highly recommend getting into some volunteering projects and various social impact initiatives in your community. Similarly, you know, if you're interested in sales and you're a financial analyst, you can actually work with a lot of local organizations who have fundraising campaigns, and going out and doing fundraising for a cause that you care about is a huge sales experience that you can get today without having to pay for a master's degree at all, to be perfectly honest. So those would be some things if you're looking to build your leadership capabilities, your abilities to strategically vision. You may want to think about being a board member for a local nonprofit, especially one that has some decision-making authority and isn't just a fundraising board. So that would be something you might want to think about getting into. You also might want to think about, there's a really cool organization called Catch a Fire, catchafire.org, I think it is. And they actually line volunteers up for projects all around the world that allow you to build some capabilities and allow you to get some experiences you can put on your resume and help small nonprofits and government organizations get some free labor. So think of it as kind of a bit of a social dating app for labor to work with nonprofits and small organizations. So those are some examples of projects I get involved in.